The heavy, humid air of Atlanta clung to my suit as I pushed open the front door of our colonial home. I was supposed to be fishing up at Lake Lanier, a weekend trip my wife Ruby had practically forced me to take for my 68th birthday. I dropped my tackle box in the foyer, expecting the smell of her famous peach cobbler or the soft hum of the living room television. Instead, a high-pitched scream shattered the quiet afternoon. It was a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. I moved with a speed I did not know, my aging knees still possessed, rushing down the hardwood hallway toward the kitchen. The sight that greeted me was pure orchestrated chaos. My wife Ruby was curled into a tight ball on the kitchen floor, right next to the granite island. She was clutching her chest, rocking back and forth, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in our 40 years of marriage. Scattered all around her were jagged shards of white and blue porcelain. It was her favorite antique tea set, the one we had bought on our anniversary in Charleston, glistening under the recessed lighting like broken teeth. Standing over her completely unscathed was my daughter Simone. Simone had her hands planted firmly on her hips, shaking her head with an exaggerated sigh of disbelief. Leaning against the counter, barely looking up from his phone, was her husband, Terrence. The moment the heavy soles of my shoes clicked against the kitchen tile, Simone snapped her head toward me. Her expression shifted instantly, morphing from cold annoyance into a theatrical, wide-eyed panic. "Oh my God, Dad, you are home early," Simone gasped, rushing over to grab my arm with a grip that felt entirely too rehearsed. "Mom is having another one of her episodes," she cried, her voice pitching up into a frantic whine. "We just stopped by to check on her and she completely lost her mind. She started screaming about intruders and threw her tea set right at the wall. Dad, she is completely losing it." I did not pull my arm away, but I did not comfort her either. I looked past my daughter down at my wife. Ruby was trembling so violently that I could hear her teeth chattering against each other, but she was not looking at the wall, and she was not looking at some imaginary intruder. She was staring directly and fearfully at Simone. I knelt down beside my wife, ignoring the sharp edges of porcelain digging into my slacks. Ruby had suffered a mild stroke 6 months ago, leaving her a bit frail and sometimes tired, but she had never been violent. Never once in her life. I reached out a hand to touch her shoulder and she flinched, shrinking away as if I were about to strike her. That tiny, terrifying reaction set off an alarm bell deep in my mind. It was an alarm I had not heard since my days working active cases for the Bureau. I looked at the floor, letting my eyes trace the blast pattern of the broken ceramics. If Ruby had thrown that teapot at the wall, as Simone claimed, the shards would be piled up near the baseboards. Instead, the broken pieces were scattered in a perfect circular pattern outward from the center of the floor. It was the exact pattern of an object smashed directly downward with violent force. I glanced up at my daughter. Simone was wearing a pristine white silk blouse, and her makeup was flawless. A woman who had just wrestled a violent dementia-ridden patient would be completely disheveled. Simone looked like she was ready for a luxury magazine shoot. Terrence finally tucked his phone into his tailored suit pocket and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, stepping forward to join the performance. I looked back down at Ruby, gently taking her trembling hand in mine. As her cardigan sleeve rode up her forearm, I saw it. Just above her gold wristwatch, a fresh red mark was rapidly blooming into a dark, ugly bruise. It was the undeniable shape of an aggressive thumbprint. Someone had grabbed her hard and forced her down. I felt a sudden icy knot twist in my stomach. The forensic accountant inside me, the man who spent 30 years analyzing crime scenes and tracking federal fraud, recognized the lie immediately. This was not a medical emergency, and my wife was not losing her mind. This was a staged scene, a violent performance, and my own flesh and blood were the architects. "Let us be realistic here, Jeremiah." "Terrence," said his voice dripping with a fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. He took a step closer, towering over me as I knelt on the floor next to my trembling wife. The doctor warned us about this decline, and dementia creates aggression. Simone and I were just talking, and we really think it is unsafe for her to be here anymore. I did not look up at him right away. I kept my eyes on Ruby, gently stroking her hair, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath her frail skin. "She is fine, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice low and intentionally shaky, playing the part of a tired old man who could not handle the stress. "She just got confused, that is all. I can take care of my own wife." Terrence scoffed, a short, arrogant sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. "Look at this mess, Jeremiah," he said, gesturing broadly to the shattered porcelain all over the floor. "You cannot take care of her alone, and you are getting too old for this kind of physical strain. It is dangerous for both of you." He reached into the inside pocket of his expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, glossy brochure and tossed it onto the granite kitchen island. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "I've already done the legwork for you," Terrence announced, crossing his arms over his chest. "Shady Pines Luxury Care Facility has a private suite opening up this Friday. It is a top-tier place, and it is expensive, but for Ruby and her safety, it is absolutely necessary." Simone stepped up next to him, wiping a completely dry eye with the back of her perfectly manicured hand. "Dad, please," she whined, her voice wavering with practiced emotion. "It breaks my heart to see Mom like this. We just want what is best for her and what is best for you. You need to rest and let the professionals handle her care." I slowly stood up, my knees popping, leaning heavily on the counter to sell the illusion of my frailty. I looked at the glossy brochure sitting on the counter. The cover showed smiling, silver-haired couples walking through manicured gardens. It looked like a luxury resort, not a medical facility, and I knew exactly what a place like that cost. "That place is $30,000 a month," I said, letting a tremor slip into my voice. "My pension pays the bills, but it does not cover a luxury resort. We do not have that kind of liquid cash sitting around." That was the opening they were waiting for. I saw the greed flash in Terrence's eyes, a quick, hungry spark that he could not completely hide. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the island, boxing me in. "That is exactly why we are here, Jeremiah." Terrence said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to strictly business. "You have the house and you have the investment portfolios. But dealing with brokers and liquidating assets, that is a massive headache. You are stressed and you are grieving the loss of your wife's mental state. You should not be dealing with bankers right now." Simone nodded vigorously, reaching out to pat my shoulder with a hand that felt as cold as ice. "Let us handle the burden, Dad," she urged. "We can get a power of attorney drawn up by tomorrow. If you sign legal control of the estate over to us, Terrence can manage the liquidations. We can make sure Mom gets the best care, and we can protect the rest of the capital from taxes. You will not have to worry about a single thing." The trap was set, and the jaws were wide open. They were not just trying to lock my wife away in a facility. They were trying to strip me of my financial independence, my home, and my entire life savings, all under the guise of family duty. If I handed over the estate, they would drain the accounts dry and leave Ruby and me to rot on the state dime. I looked at Terrence taking in his slick hair, his expensive watch, and the arrogant smirk playing on the edge of his lips. He thought I was just an outdated relic, a foolish old man who would hand over the keys to the kingdom out of pure exhaustion. He had no idea that he was standing in front of a man who used to tear apart international money laundering syndicates for breakfast. "A power of attorney," I repeated, letting my shoulders slump forward, projecting total defeat. "That is a big step, Simone. I need to think about it. I just need to get Ruby into bed right now and clean up this mess. We do not have a lot of time, Dad." Simone pressed her fake tears, instantly vanishing, replaced by a sharp, demanding tone. "That bed at Shady Pines will not hold past Friday. We need to move on this now. I said I will think about it," I replied, my voice cracking perfectly, sounding like a man on the edge of tears. "Please, just give us a moment. Let me put my wife to sleep." I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat alone in my dark study, the cold blue light of the computer monitor reflecting in my eyes. I watched the hidden camera footage from the kitchen over and over again. Every time Terrence smashed that antique teapot, every time Simone grabbed Ruby by the shoulder, a cold and calculated fire burned brighter in my chest. I spent 30 years tracking cartel money and dirty politicians for the federal government. I knew what desperate greed looked like. They wanted my estate, and they were willing to break my wife's mind to get it. I was going to give them absolutely nothing, but I needed them to believe they had already won. I needed them to step blindly into the trap. The morning sun came up over Atlanta, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway. I stood in the kitchen brewing a fresh pot of black coffee. The bitter smell usually brought me peace, but today it just smelled like burnt expectations. I heard the front door lock click open. Simone and Terrence let themselves in using the spare key they promised was only for absolute emergencies. I stayed by the granite island, holding my ceramic mug, letting my hands shake just enough to look frail and pathetic. "Good morning, Dad." Simone called out, her voice ringing out entirely too cheerful for a woman who had assaulted her mother the day before. "How is Mom doing today?" "She's resting," I said, staring down into my dark coffee, keeping my shoulders slumped. "I barely slept at all, Simone. I kept thinking about what you two said yesterday about the facility, about the power of attorney." I rubbed my eyes, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. "You are right. I am just too tired to handle the estate anymore. If her aggression gets worse, I might be in physical danger too." Terrence practically sprinted into the kitchen. He stopped right in front of the island, a massive, greedy smile spreading across his face. "I'm so glad you are being sensible, Jeremiah," he said quickly, pulling a thick stack of papers from his expensive leather briefcase. "This is for the best for all of us. I have the documents right here ready to go." I looked down at the papers. It was a complete and total surrender. It was a general power of attorney granting them full, unchecked access to the checking accounts, the investment portfolios, and the deed to this very house. It was my financial death warrant printed on crisp white paper. Terrence placed a sleek silver pen on top of the stack, his eyes gleaming. "Just sign at the bottom of the last 3 pages," he instructed, tapping the paper with his index finger. I reached for my reading glasses, moving with a slow, agonizing stiffness. I wanted him to sweat for it. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight. My hand hovered over the signature line. I looked up at Simone. She was holding her breath, her eyes locked onto the tip of the pen, completely captivated by the promise of unearned wealth. Terrence was literally vibrating with anticipation. He was already spending the money in his head, paying off his massive mob debts, securing his freedom at the cost of my life. I brought the pen tip down, resting it gently on the paper. Then I reached for my coffee mug with my left hand. I allowed a violent geriatric tremor to run all the way up my arm. My hand jerked forward with sudden force. The heavy ceramic mug slammed into the papers, tipping over instantly. Hot, dark coffee flooded across the granite counter, completely soaking the legal documents in a muddy, ruining wave. "Oh no," I cried out, dropping the pen and taking a clumsy step back. "Look at what I've done. I am so clumsy today. I'm so sorry, Terrence." Terrence lunged forward, cursing loudly under his breath. He desperately tried to snatch the papers out of the puddle, but the soaked pages tore apart in his hands, leaving him holding soggy, useless scraps of paper. "Damn it, Jeremiah," he yelled, his face turning a dark, furious shade of red. He caught himself a second later, realizing his caring son-in-law mask was slipping, and forced a tight, painful smile. "It is fine," he choked out his chest, heaving with suppressed rage. "It is just an accident. I can print another copy at the office this afternoon." I grabbed a dish towel, dabbing weakly at the ruined mess. "No, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice frail but incredibly stubborn. "Look at this disaster. Maybe this is a sign from the Lord. I am just too shaken up today to make these decisions. If I'm going to hand over a $2 million estate, I need to do it properly. I will call my lawyer Calvin and have him review everything first. We can meet with him at his office next week. Next week, Terrence gasped, the color completely draining from his face. No, Jeremiah, we cannot wait until next week. The bed at the nursing home will be gone by Friday. We do not need Calvin for this. It is just a standard form. I stopped wiping the counter and looked him dead in the eye, letting a tiny sliver of steel show through the old man facade. No, Terrence, I said firmly. If I am signing away my life, Calvin looks at it first. That is my final word on the matter. I will call you when the appointment is set. I watched the pure, unadulterated panic take over his body. His hands were shaking now, not mine. He had a hard deadline. A deadline with very dangerous men, and I had just pushed him right past it. Simone grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the hallway before he completely lost his temper and ruined their plan. "Okay, Dad," she said, her voice strained and tight. "We will talk later." I watched them hurry out the front door. Through the window, I saw Terrence kick the front tire of his luxury car in the driveway, completely unraveling in the morning sun. Good. Desperate men always make stupid, fatal mistakes, and I was going straight into the shadows to document every single one of them. I waited until the sound of Terrence and his leased German engine faded down the street. I moved back to my study, dropping the frail old man routine completely. I reached into the back of my closet, pulling out a heavy black canvas bag. It was a relic from my active duty days, filled with the tools of a very specific trade. I pulled out a digital camera, attaching a long, high-resolution telephoto lens. I checked the battery, feeling the familiar cold weight of the metal in my hands. The hunt was officially on. I grabbed my car keys, moving with a quiet, lethal purpose. Terrence thought he was outsmarting a retired accountant, but he was dealing with a ghost. I'd slipped a magnetic GPS tracker under the rear bumper of his car 3 months ago. It was just a precaution back then, a lingering instinct I could not shake. Now it was my compass. I opened the tracking application on my phone. A blinking red dot showed his vehicle speeding south toward the gritty industrial district of downtown Atlanta. That was the registered address of his tech startup, a company that never seemed to produce a single product, but always required more capital. I climbed into my nondescript beige sedan, blending perfectly into the mid-morning city traffic. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the address. It was a bleak, windowless brick warehouse surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. This was not the headquarters of a thriving tech visionary. This was a shell, a front for a man drowning in his own lies. I rolled down my window just an inch, resting the heavy camera lens against the glass. I pulled my fishing hat down low, becoming just another invisible piece of the urban landscape. I waited in the sweltering heat, my breathing slow, my eyes locked on the warehouse door. Patience is the greatest weapon an investigator can wield. 20 minutes later, Terrence pulled into the cracked asphalt lot. He did not go inside. He paced back and forth near his front bumper, checking his expensive watch every 10 seconds. He was sweating right through his custom suit, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. A few moments later, a massive black SUV rolled up to the curb, kicking up a cloud of dry gray dust. 2 men stepped out. They did not wear suits, and they did not look like venture capitalists. They wore thick leather jackets despite the Atlanta heat, and they moved with the heavy, blunt force of professional violence. I raised the camera, looking through the viewfinder. I pressed the shutter button, letting it click in a rapid, silent burst. The larger of the 2 men, a brute with a thick neck and scarred knuckles, walked straight up to Terrence. He did not say hello. He grabbed Terrence by the lapels of his ruined coffee-stained suit and shoved him violently against the brick wall. Terrence let out a terrified gasp, holding his hands up in a pathetic, pleading surrender. I zoomed in tightly on his face, capturing the raw, unedited fear in his eyes. I grabbed a small directional audio receiver from my bag, plugging a single earpiece into my ear and aiming the dish at the men. The static cleared and the harsh, guttural voice of the enforcer filled my head. "You are out of time, Terrence," the man barked, his voice laced with absolute menace. "The boss wants his money, all $500,000 by this Friday. No more extensions, no more sob stories about your rich father-in-law." "Please," Terrence begged, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "I have the money, I promise you. The old man is signing the estate over today. I just need 2 more days to liquidate the trust fund. It is worth $2 million. I will pay the interest. I will pay whatever you want. Just tell the boss to wait until Friday." The enforcer leaned in close, pressing a heavy forearm against Terrence's throat. "Friday is the end of the line," the enforcer growled, digging his forearm deeper. "If that money is not in the account by Friday noon, we are not taking your car, Terrence. We are taking your knees, and then we are visiting your lovely wife, Simone." The enforcer let go, letting Terrence slide down the brick wall, gasping for air. The 2 men climbed back into the black SUV, the tires squealing as they sped away from the lot. Terrence stayed on the ground for a long time, clutching his chest, a broken, desperate man. I lowered the camera, saving the audio file to my encrypted drive. $500,000. The number echoed in the quiet cab of my sedan. He was not just a terrible businessman. He was in deep with a violent mob syndicate, gambling away money he never had. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. Friday. That was the absolute deadline. That was why Simone was so desperate to get Ruby into a nursing home right now. That was why they needed me declared incompetent by the end of the week. They were going to steal my entire life savings to pay off a mob debt, and they were willing to destroy my family to do it. I looked at Terrence wiping the dirt off his suit, trying to regain a shred of his fake dignity. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess. He did not realize I'd already flipped the board. I put my car in drive, slipping away from the curb, leaving him alone in the dust. I had the motive, and now I needed the paper trail. The drive from the industrial park to the financial district of Atlanta was a straight shot, but it felt like crossing into another world. I parked my sedan in the secure visitor structure of the First National Bank, slipping my parking ticket deep into my pocket. I stepped out into the blinding midday sun, pulling my shoulders forward and letting my spine curve just a fraction. I needed to be the harmless retiree today, a man simply checking on his pension, not a federal auditor on the warpath. I walked through the heavy glass doors, instantly feeling the crisp, sanitized air of the corporate lobby hit my face. I bypassed the long line of customers waiting for the tellers, shuffling my feet slowly across the polished marble floor. I headed straight for the frosted glass offices in the back, where the serious money was handled. The branch manager, a man named Franklin, had been a junior loan officer 20 years ago when I first deposited my federal pension into this branch. Franklin looked up from his massive mahogany desk, his eyes widening in genuine surprise as he saw me standing in his doorway. "Jeremiah, it is a huge surprise to see you down here today," Franklin said quickly, standing up and buttoning his tailored suit jacket. "I thought you were up at Lake Lanier for your birthday weekend. How is Ruby doing?" "She is struggling, Franklin," I said, letting a heavy, exhausted sigh escape my chest. "That is actually exactly why I'm here today. We are trying to get all our affairs in order, and it is just overwhelming for an old man." Franklin nodded with a practiced corporate sympathy, walking around his desk and gesturing for me to sit in the plush leather chair opposite him. "Of course, Jeremiah," he murmured, taking his seat and folding his hands. "How can I help you navigate this difficult time?" "I need to access the full records for the small business loan from 2018, I said, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. "The one for that technology consulting firm." The one my son-in-law, Terrence, started up. Franklin frowned, his fingers pausing over his computer keyboard. Jeremiah, I believe Terrence closed that specific credit line late last year, he explained gently, looking at me with pity. He refinanced the debt with a secondary lender, so I do not think you have access to those files anymore. I stopped playing the frail grandfather right then and there. I sat up perfectly straight, planting my feet firmly on the carpet, and rested my elbows heavily on his desk. I stared at him directly over the rim of my reading glasses, letting the cold steel of my old profession bleed into my voice. Check the fine print, Franklin, I said, my tone completely flat and commanding. I was the co-signer and the primary guarantor on that note. Unless Terrence paid off the principal balance in full with a certified cashier, check my name is still permanently attached to the master file. And we both know Terrence has never paid off a debt in full in his entire life. Franklin swallowed hard, clearly taken aback by the sudden intense shift in my demeanor. As the primary guarantor, I have the absolute legal right to audit the account activity. I continued, not breaking eye contact for a single second. I need to ensure my personal liability is covered. Pull it up, Franklin, right now. Franklin hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning back to his glowing monitor. He typed in a rapid sequence of commands, his eyes scanning the screen. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline, a look of genuine shock crossing his face. You are absolutely right, Jeremiah, he stammered, his corporate polish cracking. Your name is still attached as the secondary liability holder. The account was never actually closed. It is actually in massive arrears. Print it, I ordered, my voice cutting through the quiet office like a scalpel. I want all of it, Franklin. Every single transaction, every wire transfer, and every withdrawal for the last 24 months. And while you are at it, pull the full credit inquiry report. I want to know exactly who else has been looking at his financials. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the office began to hum a rhythmic mechanical sound that felt like a ticking clock. Franklin handed me a thick, warm stack of paper, his hands trembling slightly as he passed it over the desk. I put on my reading glasses, taking the documents from him. The polished mahogany desk, the marble floors, and the sterile bank lobby completely faded away. I was no longer an old man in Atlanta. I was back in the bureau, sitting in a windowless room, analyzing the rapid decay of a criminal enterprise. The black and white numbers printed on the page were not just digits to me. They were a detailed chronological confession. I started with the business expense columns, or rather the complete lack of them. There were absolutely no payments for server space, no payroll deposits for developers, and no marketing costs at all. Terrence Technology Company was a complete ghost ship, a hollow shell designed to bleed money. But the money was going somewhere, and I needed to know the destination. I pulled a red pen from my breast pocket, uncapping it with a quiet click. I started scanning the outbound wire transfers, tracing the lifeblood of my estate as it flowed into the shadows. I stared down at the crisp white pages, my red pen, hovering over the columns of data like a hungry hawk circling a wounded animal. The first pattern emerged almost immediately, and it made my stomach twist with a cold, sharp disgust. There was a recurring massive transfer routed through a complex series of shell accounts, ending up in an entity called Golden Chip Holdings down in the Cayman Islands. I recognized the routing sequence instantly from my old federal task force days. It was not a technology vendor, and it was certainly not a venture capital firm. It was an offshore banking portal used almost exclusively by unregulated high-stakes online gambling syndicates. I tracked the specific dates, drawing heavy red circles around the numbers. The frequency of the outbound transfers told a very clear story of a man completely and utterly out of control. 2 years ago, it was $5,000 every other month. A manageable vice, perhaps, for a struggling businessman. But a year ago, the frequency escalated rapidly, jumping to $10,000 a week. And in the last 6 long months, The financial bleeding had become a daily, unstoppable hemorrhage. $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 wired directly out into the digital ether, completely vanishing into the deep pockets of the house. Terrence was not just a failing entrepreneur playing at being a wealthy executive. He was a degenerate, desperate gambler chasing an impossible losing streak that had spiraled into absolute madness. I did the mental math in my head, adding up the red circles in the margins of the bank report. He had burned through over $300,000 of the business loan entirely on blackjack tables and offshore sports bets, but the gambling was only half of the horror hidden deeply in the ledgers. I flipped the heavy page to the second section of the report, the area detailing the supplementary corporate credit cards. I fully expected to see Terrence's name again, hiding personal travel expenses or luxury car rentals. Instead, the name printed clearly at the top of the statement made the breath catch painfully in my throat. It was Simone. My own daughter, the very woman who had stood in my kitchen just yesterday, crying fake dramatic tears about the overwhelming cost of her mother's medical care, was listed as an authorized user. The account was supposed to be for office supplies and legitimate client entertainment. I scanned her transaction history, and the deep grief in my chest instantly hardened into a solid block of freezing ice. It was a grotesque, unending display of pure, unadulterated vanity. $2,000 at a luxury boutique in Manhattan swiped on a random Tuesday afternoon. $4,000 for an exclusive weekend retreat at a mountain spa complete with hot stone massages and expensive champagne brunches. $1,200 for a single designer handbag purchased just 3 days after Ruby had suffered her stroke. There were endless, sickening pages of charges for cosmetic procedures, private Pilates sessions, and extravagant Michelin-starred dinners. I kept adding the numbers, my red pen moving mechanically down the long columns. In a single devastating year, Simone had spent $80,000 of stolen, borrowed money. $80,000. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, leaning back heavily into the plush leather chair. I remembered Simone as a sweet little girl sitting at our kitchen table, carefully saving her weekly allowance in a glass jar, just so she could buy me a cheap striped tie for Father's Day. That sweet, innocent little girl was completely dead and gone. The callous woman who had replaced her was an empty vessel desperately trying to fill the massive void in her soul with designer labels and expensive vacations. She was not trying to protect her frail mother from a declining mind. She was protecting her own lavish lifestyle from the crushing incoming reality of bankruptcy. She knew Terrence was failing, and instead of stopping him, she decided to grab as much cash as she could possibly carry before the ship finally sank beneath the dark waves. I opened my eyes slowly, looking up at Franklin across the polished desk. He was watching me with a nervous, wide-eyed expression, his hands tightly clasped together on the mahogany surface. "Is it bad, Jeremiah?" he asked softly, completely dropping the formal, professional corporate facade. "It is much worse than bad, Franklin," I said, keeping my voice dangerously flat and terrifyingly calm. "It is grand theft, and it is federal wire fraud. But I need to see one more thing right now. I need you to pull up the pending transaction queue. I need to know exactly what they are trying to steal today." Franklin swallowed hard, quickly turning his full attention back to his glowing monitor. He clicked his mouse rapidly, refreshing the secure internal banking system. "Nothing is pending right now, Jeremiah," he said, his voice tinged with a slight hopeful relief. "Wait." His face suddenly went completely pale, all the color draining out of his cheeks in a single terrifying second. He leaned closer to the bright screen, squinting his eyes as if the computer system was playing a cruel, unbelievable trick on him. "What is it?" I demanded, the sharp, commanding tone of my voice making him jump slightly in his expensive leather chair. A security alert just popped up on the dashboard. Franklin stammered, his hand visibly shaking as he pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "It is a manual withdrawal request. It was automatically flagged by the fraud detection system simply because of the sheer size of the requested amount." How much, Franklin? I asked, leaning my heavy frame over the mahogany desk, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. $50,000. Franklin whispered, his eyes wide with absolute panic. It is a request for a physical, untraceable cash withdrawal. And Jeremiah, it is happening right now down at the 4th Street branch across town. I stood up so fast that my heavy leather chair hit the wall behind me. 4th Street was only 10 minutes away from my current location. Who is authorizing this transaction right now? I asked, my voice echoing in the small glass office. Franklin turned his computer monitor around so it was facing me completely. It is a countercheck, Jeremiah, he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. And it has your exact signature right at the bottom. I leaned in closely, staring at the high-definition digital scan of the paper check. It was an absolute masterpiece of criminal forgery. The heavy loop of the J was perfect, and the sharp slant of the M in my last name was completely identical to my own handwriting. Terrence had obviously spent countless hours practicing this exact motion. He had likely traced my signature from old birthday cards or perhaps stolen tax documents from my home study. He thought he was brilliant, but he had made one fatal, arrogant error. 3 years ago, after a minor data breach at a federal agency, I had started adding a microscopic dot right inside the bottom loop of the letter H in my signature. It was completely invisible to the naked eye, but it was absolutely clear to a trained forensic accountant. I stared at the bright screen, letting a cold, grim satisfaction wash over me. The signature on the screen did not have the hidden dot. Freeze the transaction right now, Franklin, I ordered, keeping my eyes locked on the digital forgery. Franklin looked up at me, his face a mask of absolute terror. I cannot just freeze a cleared account without a sworn fraud affidavit, Jeremiah, he stammered, his hands hovering over the keyboard. If it is your verified signature, the bank is legally obligated to release the cash. It is not my signature, Franklin. I snarled, slamming my flat palm down hard onto the polished mahogany desk. That piece of paper is a federal forgery, and the man standing at the teller counter on 4th Street right now is committing a massive felony. Do not decline the transaction, and do not call the local police. That will just scare him away, and he will run. Franklin swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. Then what do you want me to do, Jeremiah? He asked, his voice shaking. Flag the check for a mandatory manual review. I instructed, my mind working 3 steps ahead of the panicked bank manager. Send a direct private message to the teller right now. Tell her to smile and say the main vault is on a strict time lock and he simply has to wait 20 minutes for the cash to be released. Franklin reached for his internal phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the receiver. What exactly are you going to do, Jeremiah? He asked, looking at me like I was a dangerous stranger. I'm going to let him sweat, I said slowly, gathering the massive stack of printed financial evidence and sliding it carefully into my leather briefcase. I'm going to let him stand right there in the lobby, watching the clock tick down, thinking he has actually won the game. I want him to feel the heavy stacks of cash in his hands and his greedy imagination, and then I want him to walk out the front doors completely empty-handed and desperate. But Jeremiah, Franklin said, holding the heavy phone receiver tightly against his ear. If he owes $500,000 to the kind of people I think he owes money to, and he walks out of that bank without that cash today, then he is a dead man walking. I finished closing the golden clasps on my briefcase, the sharp click echoing in the quiet room. He made his own bed. Franklin, I said, my voice as cold as the bottom of the ocean. Now he gets to lie in it. I walked out of the frosted glass office and strode purposefully across the polished marble lobby. I stepped back out into the bright, blinding morning sunlight. The evidence inside my briefcase felt incredibly heavy, like a solid block of lead pulling me down toward the pavement. I finally had the entire paper trail. I had the undeniable financial motive. I knew exactly why they had targeted my frail wife. They desperately needed to liquidate her massive trust fund just to cover the violent hole they had dug for themselves. Terrence was standing at the 4th Street branch right at this very moment. He was probably checking his expensive watch, sweating straight through his cheap suit, waiting for $50,000 that was never ever coming. I walked to my beige sedan, pulling my phone from my pocket. I opened the tracking application, watching the red dot blinking steadily at the bank location. I could have driven over there right then. I could have walked into that busy lobby, confronted him in front of the security guards, and humiliated him completely. But that would have been an emotional, messy reaction. And Jeremiah Mercer, the man who hunted cartels, did not do messy. I needed him to panic. I needed him to realize that the easy money was completely blocked off, pushing him to make a much larger, far more dangerous mistake. Desperate men always return to the scene of the crime when their alternative plans fall apart. I pulled out of the parking structure, merging smoothly into the heavy Atlanta traffic. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning a pale white against the dark leather. The numbers from the bank ledger were rapidly rearranging themselves inside my mind. $500,000 in mob debt, $80,000 in pure selfish luxury shopping, $50,000 in attempted blatant theft. They were completely drowning in their own endless greed, and they had arrogantly tried to use my wife as a convenient life raft. They had made a massive, fatal calculation when they looked at me. They saw gray hair, and they assumed I was weak. They saw a retired grandfather, and they assumed I was just a tragic statistic waiting to be exploited. They were about to find out very quickly that they had grossly miscalculated the situation. And in my particular line of work, a calculation error of this magnitude was always absolutely fatal. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the long road ahead, but my tactical mind was already 3 complex moves ahead of them on the chessboard. The opening moves were finished, and the endgame had officially begun. Tracking a desperate subject through the sprawling arteries of Atlanta is an absolute art form. It requires immense patience and the unique ability to become completely invisible in plain sight. I sat comfortably in my nondescript sedan, keeping a safe distance of 3 cars back, watching Terrence weave recklessly through the midday traffic. He was driving like a man running from his own shadow, swerving aggressively across the lanes. The bank had undoubtedly stalled him exactly as I had instructed Franklin to do. He had stood at that teller window, sweating through his custom suit, waiting for $50,000 that was never released. Now he was completely empty-handed, and the mob deadline was breathing down his neck. I fully expected him to drive straight back to his warehouse to panic, or perhaps to scramble for another pathetic loan. Instead, his leased luxury car took a sharp turn, heading directly toward the wealthy riverfront district. It was a place constructed of towering glass high-rises and overpriced bistros where a single cup of coffee cost more than my first hourly wage. I kept my foot light on the gas pedal, maintaining my invisible tether. My hands were steady on the leather steering wheel, but my mind was violently racing, tearing through the massive financial data I had just uncovered. Terrence was drowning in $500,000 of syndicate debt. Yet here he was aggressively driving into the most expensive zip code in the entire city. It was a staggering paradox, a delusion that only a true narcissist could justify to himself. He abruptly pulled his vehicle into the valet parking lane of the Sapphire Towers. It was a massive luxury condominium complex designed specifically to cater to the young, untouchable elite of the city. I smoothly parked my sedan across the wide street, wedging it neatly next to a newspaper stand, and carefully adjusted my rearview mirror. I sat in the quiet air conditioning, watching intently as Terrence stepped out of his car. He did not look like a man facing imminent physical destruction. He quickly checked his slick hair in the tinted reflection of the window, smoothed down the lapels of his wrinkled jacket, and arrogantly handed the valet a cash tip that I knew he could not afford. He did not go inside the towering glass building immediately. He stood arrogantly by the rushing water of the marble fountain, pulling out his phone and checking his expensive watch for the 10th time. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors slid open and a woman walked out into the bright sunlight. She was young, perhaps half my age, with bright blonde hair styled in loose, expensive waves. She was carrying a designer handbag, one that looked shockingly similar to the one Simone had purchased with my corporate card last month. But unlike my daughter, who wore her underlying anxiety like a heavy coat, this young woman radiated a careless, untouchable arrogance. She walked straight up to Terrence, wrapping her arms around his neck, and kissed him deeply. It was not a friendly, casual peck on the cheek. It was a deliberate, possessive claim of absolute ownership. I felt a sudden violent surge of nausea rise in my throat, not because of the infidelity itself, but because of the staggering, multi-layered betrayal of my own daughter. Simone was at home right now, terrified about losing her sprawling mansion, terrified about her mother, and genuinely believing that her husband was out working to save their crumbling lives. Instead, he was standing here in the sunlight, playing the grand role of the wealthy benefactor. They walked arm in arm, laughing together, heading toward a crowded outdoor cafe situated right next to the luxury building. The patio was bustling with wealthy patrons, which was absolutely perfect for my needs. I grabbed my faded fishing hat and my dark sunglasses and stepped out of my hot car. I moved my body with the slow, shuffling gait of a tired, confused old man who had absolutely nowhere important to be today. It was the perfect invisible disguise. No one looks twice at a retiree slowly reading a newspaper in the corner. I carefully navigated the crowded patio, taking a small wrought iron table exactly 2 rows behind them. My view was partially blocked by a large, leafy, potted fern shielding my face completely. I ordered a simple iced tea from the passing waiter and calmly placed my phone on the tabletop, facing completely down. The specialized recording application was already running silently, specifically calibrated to pick up directional audio from their exact location. I reached into my pocket and discreetly placed a wireless earbud into my right ear. Suddenly, the chaotic background noise of the heavy city traffic completely faded away, replaced by the clear, amplified voices of my criminal son-in-law and his beautiful mistress. "You look really tense today, baby," the young woman said, her voice light and musical, completely unburdened by the crushing reality of overdue mob notices. Terrence let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, the pathetic sound of a man carrying the immense weight of his own calculated lies. "It is just the old man today," he complained, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Jeremiah is being incredibly difficult. He almost signed the power of attorney this morning, but his shaky, geriatric hands spilled hot coffee all over the legal documents. I swear to God he is starting to lose his mind, just like his crazy wife." The blonde woman giggled, a sharp, dismissive sound that made my jaw clench tight. "Well, you promised me it would be completely done by Friday, Terrence," she pouted, stirring her expensive drink. "My lease is up next month, and you promised me we would be looking at actual penthouses, not just renewing my lease in this building." I gripped my glass of iced tea so hard the condensation dripped down my knuckles. Penthouses. He was promising this young woman a multi-million-dollar penthouse while he was actively conspiring to lock my frail wife in a state-funded psychiatric facility simply because he claimed we were broke. "Do not worry, baby," Terrence said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a low, conspiratorial whisper. "I have the entire situation completely under control. We are moving the timeline up right now. I'm putting Ruby in that locked facility by the end of this week. Once she is completely locked away, Jeremiah will just collapse. He cannot function without her making his meals. I will have him legally declared incompetent by Monday morning." I froze in my seat, the ice-cold glass of tea suddenly slipping in my grip. Declare me legally incompetent. That was his ultimate endgame. He was not just trying to steal my financial assets to pay off his massive debts. He was actively planning to strip me of my basic human rights, to completely erase me from the legal world. "And what about the big house?" the young blonde woman asked, taking a long, slow sip of her expensive white wine. "It is as good as sold," Terrence boasted, puffing out his chest with absolute sickening confidence. "I already have a private developer deeply interested in the lot. It is a $2 million portfolio plus the cash value of the primary residence. That is more than enough to pay off my aggressive investors and still have plenty left over for us. We can finally take that long luxury trip to Paris, just you and me. No nagging wife complaining about bills and no crying kids pulling at my legs. I sat perfectly still behind the large potted fern listening to this pathetic, desperate man sell my entire life. He was trading my home, and he was trading my wife dignity, all for a European vacation and a young mistress. He spoke about my family as if we were just livestock waiting to be liquidated at a public auction. There was absolutely no remorse in his voice and no hesitation in his greedy heart. There was only the cold, mechanical calculation of a parasite looking for its next wealthy host. "But Simone thinks you guys are completely broke right now," the blonde woman said, pausing her drink and looking at him with a slight confused frown. "Will she not notice when you suddenly have millions of dollars in your bank account?" Terrence let out a loud, cruel laugh. It was a dismissive, ugly sound that echoed across the crowded outdoor patio. "Simone believes absolutely whatever I tell her to believe," he sneered, waving his hand in the air like he was swatting away a small, annoying insect. "I will just tell her the estate money is tied up in a strict, irrevocable trust, and we can only access a very small monthly stipend. She is so incredibly desperate to keep up her fake wealthy appearances, she will not even ask any hard questions. She is weak and she is stupid. That is exactly why I need you, baby. You are strong, and you deserve the absolute best." I had heard more than enough. The sheer, overwhelming audacity of his plan was almost hard to process. He was going to leave his own wife, my daughter, completely destitute and utterly alone while he ran off to Europe with my stolen life savings. And Simone was completely blind to all of it, actively helping him dig her own tragic grave. I slowly reached into the deep inside pocket of my faded jacket and pulled out my compact digital camera. It was a very small device, but it was fitted with a highly advanced professional grade lens. I waited patiently in the heavy, humid heat. I waited for the absolute, perfect, undeniable moment. I watched closely as Terrence leaned aggressively across the small wrought iron table. He reached out, and he gently held her soft hand, looking deeply into her eyes with that practiced, fake sincerity he had used on my daughter for over 10 years. I aimed the high-resolution lens straight through a small gap in the green fern leaves. I pressed the silent shutter button. I caught the intimate touch, the loving smile, and the expensive wine bottle sitting between them. I captured the absolute undeniable proof of his total moral bankruptcy. But I was not done yet. I waited again, blending perfectly into the background noise of the busy street. I watched like a hawk until the sharply dressed waiter finally brought the leather check folder to their table. I watched Terrence confidently pull a heavy metal credit card from his expensive wallet. I zoomed the powerful lens in tight, focusing directly on the front of that specific card, right as he placed it proudly on the silver tray. It was a corporate credit card. It was my corporate credit card, the exact one permanently attached to the business account I had personally co-signed. He was paying for his young mistress lunch with the very money he was actively stealing from my family. I pressed the shutter button again and again and again. I took a dozen crystal-clear photographs. I carefully documented the exact address of the luxury building. I captured the clear license plate of her sleek sports car right when the valet brought it around to the front curb. I documented every single damning second of his absolute betrayal. As they finally stood up to leave the patio, Terrence pulled her in close by the waist and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh loudly. They looked like the absolute perfect wealthy couple. They were young, successful, and completely happy. They had absolutely no idea that the tired old man sitting just 2 tables away, adjusting his hearing aid, had just fully loaded the weapon that would completely end their entire world. I waited in my chair until they were completely gone, disappearing into the dark, tinted windows of his leased luxury car. I slowly stood up from the small metal table My legs felt incredibly heavy, but it was not from my age, and it was not from the sweltering city heat. It was from the massive, crushing burden of the truth I was carrying. I had gone looking for simple financial fraud, and I had successfully found total, unforgivable moral bankruptcy. I looked down at the small digital screen on the back of my camera. Terrence's face was completely clear, and his guilt was absolute. There was no denying these photographs. This was not just evidence for a messy divorce court. This was the exact heavy leverage I desperately needed to completely separate the wolves from each other. Simone was a willing participant in the vicious scheme against me, yes, but she was primarily motivated by deep fear and intense financial manipulation. Terrence was the true evil architect of this nightmare. If I showed these crisp, undeniable photos to Simone, she would completely shatter into a million pieces. And in her shattered, betrayed state, she might just be willing to turn on him simply to save her own skin. I walked slowly back to my beige sedan, feeling a freezing, absolute resolve finally settle over my racing heart. The deep heartbreak of a father was completely gone rapidly, replaced by an intense, tactical clarity. Terrence desperately wanted to send me to a locked nursing home. He arrogantly wanted to sell my house, the house I built with my own two hands. He wanted to completely erase me from the earth. He had made the classic, fatal mistake of every amateur criminal I had ever hunted. He assumed his quiet victim was fast asleep. But I was not asleep. I was wide awake, and I was watching his every single move. I started the quiet engine of my car and checked the dashboard clock. It was early afternoon in Atlanta. I had the damning financial bank records in my heavy briefcase. I had the high-resolution photographic evidence burning a hole in my camera. Now I desperately needed to return to my house and carefully prepare the final stage for the absolute last act. I drove home slowly, mentally rehearsing the difficult lines I would have to say when I walked back through my front door. I would have to look directly at my daughter, fully knowing her husband was actively cheating on her, and I would have to say absolutely nothing. I would have to look Terrence in the eye fully, knowing he planned to declare me legally insane by Monday, and I would have to shake his hand. It would be the absolute hardest, most painful performance of my entire life. But for Ruby, for the woman who had bravely stood by my side for 40 long years, I would willingly become the greatest actor the world had ever seen. The storm was coming for you, Terrence, and you just bought yourself a front row ticket. The drive back from the city felt completely different, the heavy weight of the evidence burning a deep hole in my pocket. The hot anger I had felt on that sunny cafe patio was rapidly replaced by a cold, sharp knot of deep anxiety in my stomach. I knew Terrence and Simone were incredibly desperate. I knew they had a strict, violent deadline with the mob. And desperate people do not just make stupid financial mistakes. They make dangerous physical threats against the innocent. I pulled my beige sedan into my quiet driveway and immediately noticed that Simone's luxury SUV was completely gone. Our large colonial house stood completely silent against the gray late afternoon sky. It looked like the safe sanctuary it had always been for 40 years. But as I walked up the front steps, I knew, deep in my bones, that it was now an active crime scene. I quickly unlocked the heavy front door and called out loudly for Ruby. There was absolutely no answer. I moved rapidly through the long hallway, dropping my keys onto the wooden side table. Ruby was usually sitting in the bright sunroom at this specific hour, reading her mystery novels or simply enjoying the warm afternoon light. I found her sitting there, but she was not reading. She was completely slumped over in her favorite floral armchair, her head lolling dangerously to the side at a highly unnatural angle. Her mouth was hanging slightly open, and a thin, wet line of drool trailed slowly down her chin. My heart stopped beating completely. For one terrifying second, I thought she was already dead. "Ruby," I whispered loudly, rushing to her side and falling to my knees. I grabbed her thin wrist, pressing my fingers frantically against her pale skin. Her pulse was there, but it was incredibly slow. It was much too slow for a woman with her specific heart condition. Her eyes fluttered open weakly, but they absolutely did not focus on me. She looked straight through me, staring blankly at the far wall. "Who are you?" She slurred her words, sounding incredibly thick, like her tongue was suddenly too big for her dry mouth. "I want to go home right now." "We are home, Ruby," I said gently, smoothing the gray hair back from her clammy, cold forehead. "You are perfectly safe right here." She shook her head weakly, her eyes rolling back slightly. "No," she mumbled, her breathing shallow and raspy. "Simone said I have to sleep now." Simone gave me the new pills. I froze completely, the blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. The new pills. I quickly looked at the small wooden side table resting right next to her floral chair. Her plastic daily pill organizer was sitting there wide open. The small compartment for Tuesday afternoon was completely empty. I absolutely knew Ruby's strict medical routine. She only took a standard beta blocker for her heart arrhythmia and a mild vitamin supplement right after lunch. Neither of those specific drugs caused this terrifying kind of catatonic stupor. I grabbed the plastic pill organizer and closely examined the compartments for the rest of the week. The small white pills looked correct at first glance. They were small, completely round and white, just exactly like her prescribed heart medication. To the untrained casual eye, they were completely identical. But I was not an untrained eye. I'd spent decades looking for microscopic dots on counterfeit federal currency and deeply analyzing chemical ink compounds on forged bank ledgers. I picked up one of the small white pills from the Wednesday compartment and held it up directly to the bright light of the window. My wife's real heart medication was a generic brand clearly stamped with the specific code M42. The small pill resting in the palm of my hand was stamped with a completely different code. It read Xanax 2. I felt the remaining color completely drain from my face. This was not life-saving heart medication. This was a massive high-dose benzodiazepine, a highly powerful sedative used to treat severe psychiatric panic disorders. In an elderly, fragile patient with a known history of strokes, a massive dose this high would not just make them sleepy. It would quickly induce severe confusion, massive memory loss, and total motor control failure. It mimics the exact terrifying symptoms of advanced aggressive dementia. Simone and Terrence were not just patiently waiting for her to naturally decline. They were actively chemically manufacturing her tragic decline. They were deliberately poisoning my wife simply to prove to the local doctors and the state courts that she was completely incompetent. I went straight to the kitchen and found the orange prescription bottle sitting innocently in the wooden cabinet. The printed label clearly said metoprolol, but the white pills inside were completely switched. Simone must have done it this morning while I was out at the bank. She had deliberately swapped the contents fully, knowing that if the city paramedics or the social workers came, they would only quickly check the printed label on the bottle. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, my knuckles turning bone white with pure, unadulterated rage. This was nothing less than attempted murder. If Ruby took too many of these heavy sedatives with her weak heart, she could easily go into total respiratory arrest. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to drive straight over to Terrence's warehouse and beat him until he could not physically stand. But I violently stopped myself. Brutal violence was their clumsy language. Meticulous, undeniable strategy was mine. If I called the police right now, they would easily claim it was just an honest mistake. They would lie to the cops and say Ruby simply got confused and mixed up her old medicine bottles. They would say I was the one who mixed them up because I was an old senile fool. Without concrete, undeniable video proof of the actual switch, it was simply my word against theirs. And right now, my word was worth absolutely nothing because they had already planted the dark seeds of doubt about my own mental state. I had to be infinitely smarter than them. I ran quickly upstairs to the master bathroom and dug frantically through my old leather travel kit. I always kept a secret emergency supply of our real medications hidden in there just for unexpected trips. I found the real life-saving bottle of heart medication. I went back downstairs to the kitchen and completely emptied the poisoned heavy sedatives into a clear plastic bag, which I immediately hid deep inside the hollow leg of the dining room table. Then I carefully refilled the orange prescription bottle and her weekly plastic organizer with the real proper heart medication. Now came the absolute hardest part of the entire day. I went back to the quiet sunroom. I took a cool, wet cloth and gently wiped my wife's pale face. I slowly made her drink 2 full glasses of cold water, desperately trying to help flush the heavy sedative out of her fragile system. I sat closely with her, holding her cold hand, praying silently in the quiet house, fully knowing the true war had officially crossed my threshold. It took over 2 agonizing hours of pacing the quiet sunroom, but slowly the heavy chemical fog began to lift from my wife. Her eyes, those beautiful brown eyes I had loved for 40 years, finally regained their sharp, clear intelligence. She blinked rapidly, looking around our familiar home as if waking up from a terrible, vivid nightmare. "Jeremiah," she whispered, her voice still weak, but entirely her own again. I felt so incredibly strange. I felt like I was completely drowning on dry land. I pulled her close to my chest, kissing the top of her gray hair, thanking the Lord she was still breathing. "I know, my love," I said quietly, holding her trembling hands in mine. "I know exactly what they did to you today." Ruby looked up at me, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What do you mean, Jeremiah?" she asked, her breathing finally steadying. I took a deep breath, preparing to break the heart of the woman I swore to protect. "Simone and Terrence switched your heart pills, Ruby," I explained, looking directly into her eyes so she knew the absolute truth. "They deliberately gave you high-dose sedatives, powerful drugs meant to make you look completely insane. They are actively trying to make you look like a danger to yourself so they can legally lock you away in a psychiatric facility." The profound betrayal hit her much harder than the heavy drugs ever could. Ruby gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in absolute shock. Her own daughter, the child she carried and raised with unconditional love, had maliciously poisoned her. She started to cry silent, agonizing tears that ran quickly down her pale cheeks. "Why, Jeremiah?" she asked, her voice cracking with pure heartbreak. "Why on earth are they doing this to us?" "Because they are completely drowning in massive mob debt, Ruby," I said, wiping the tears from her face with my thumb. "And they arrogantly believe that our estate is the only thing standing between them and a violent death." I explained everything to her in short, brutal sentences. I told her about Terrence and his $500,000 gambling debt, the violent men at the warehouse, the young blonde mistress, and the forged bank checks. I laid out their entire sickening plot to steal our $2 million trust fund and leave us with absolutely nothing. Ruby listened in complete silence, the soft, motherly warmth in her eyes slowly vanishing, rapidly replaced by the cold, hard resolve of a true survivor. I completely switched the pills back, I assured her, squeezing her hand tightly. "You are going to be perfectly fine physically, but right now I desperately need you to do something incredibly difficult for me." "What do you need me to do?" she asked, wiping her eyes and sitting up perfectly straight. "We absolutely cannot let them know that we are onto their scheme," I said, leaning in close so our foreheads were almost touching. "Not yet, Ruby. We desperately need them to believe their vicious plan is actually working perfectly. We need them to confidently bring the final contracts, and we absolutely need them to commit their federal crimes right in front of credible witnesses. I need you to act, Ruby," I instructed, feeling the heavy burden of my request. When Simone inevitably comes back tomorrow morning, or when they finally bring that state social worker into our house, I need you to pretend you are still heavily sedated. I need you to act completely confused and deeply paranoid. I need you to loudly ask for people who are dead, and I need you to completely forget who I am." Ruby recoiled instantly, shaking her head in firm protest. "Jeremiah, I absolutely cannot do that," she pleaded, her eyes widening with fresh panic. "It is too painful, and I do not want to look like a crazy old fool." "You absolutely have to do it, my love," I urged her, keeping my voice steady and commanding. "If they suspect for one single second that the drugs are not working, they might try something much worse. Terrence is desperate enough to push you right down the stairs and claim it was a tragic accident. We have to make them feel completely safe, and we have to make them think they have officially won the war." She looked silently at the antique tea set which I had carefully glued back together on the shelf. She looked at the framed photograph of Simone on the stone mantelpiece taken on the day of her high school graduation. Then she looked right back at me. The softness was completely gone. "Okay, Jeremiah," she whispered, her voice finding a new solid strength. "I will do exactly what you say. I will give them the absolute performance of a lifetime." That evening, we sat together in the dark living room, holding hands, and intensely rehearsing our macabre theater. I carefully quizzed her on exactly how to act deeply disoriented. I taught her how to slur her speech just enough to be highly convincing, but not quite enough to trigger a genuine medical emergency call. At exactly 7 o'clock, the kitchen phone rang loudly. I checked the caller identification. It was Simone. I pressed the speaker button and gave my wife a firm nod. "Hi, Dad," Simone said, her voice dripping with fake, sickening concern. "How is Mom doing tonight? Did she take her daily medicine?" Ruby leaned directly toward the speakerphone, taking a deep, theatrical breath. "Who is that loud woman?" Ruby called out, her voice trembling and completely high-pitched. "Is that the annoying lady from the church? Tell her I absolutely do not want any of her cookies. Her cookies are completely full of spiders." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then I heard Simone actually exhale a breath that sounded exactly like pure relief. "Oh wow, Dad, she sounds really terrible tonight," Simone said, failing to hide the smug satisfaction in her voice. "See, I told you the mental decline was rapidly accelerating. I played my pathetic part perfectly. I just do not know what to do anymore, Simone," I stammered, making my voice shake. "She does not even recognize our own house." "Just stay calm, Dad," Simone directed, practically smiling through the phone line. "I've already arranged for the state social worker to come to the house tomorrow morning for the final official assessment. Just keep her comfortable tonight. It will all be completely over very soon." "Yes, Simone," I said, looking directly at my beautiful wife, who was now sitting up perfectly straight and sipping her water with total composure. "It will all be over very soon." I hung up the phone, the loud click echoing in the dark room. Ruby looked over at me and actually winked her right eye. "How was my acting?" she asked quietly. "Worthy of an Academy Award?" I replied, but deep inside my chest, a massive fire was raging out of control. My own daughter was completely relieved that her mother was seeing imaginary spiders. Tomorrow they would walk right through my front door, expecting to easily conquer 2 helpless victims. Instead, they were walking blindly into a federal bear trap, and I had just finished sharpening the steel teeth. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. It did not sound like a friendly visit from a neighbor. It sounded exactly like a heavy wooden gavel hitting a judge desk. I was sitting in my worn living room chair, wearing my oldest gray cardigan, the one with the completely frayed cuffs. Ruby was safely resting upstairs, or rather, she was perfectly pretending to rest, exactly as we had planned in the dark. I watched quietly through the sheer front curtains as a cheap silver sedan pulled up right behind Simone's luxury vehicle. A small, nervous man stepped out onto the driveway. He was wearing a shiny polyester suit, and he was carrying a battered briefcase that looked like it had never seen the inside of a real courtroom. This was the executioner my own daughter had hired to completely erase me. Simone eagerly opened the heavy front door before the man could even knock. She was wearing her absolute best performance face today. Her eyes were artificially red as if she had been crying all morning long, and her posture was dramatically slumped, carrying the fake weight of our family burdens. "Come right in, Mr. Davis," she whispered loudly in the foyer, making sure I could hear every single word. "Thank you so much for coming on such incredibly short notice. We are just completely desperate today, and we simply do not know what else to do." They walked slowly into the living room. Davis was a small, shifting man with incredibly greedy eyes and the distinct stale smell of cheap cigarette smoke clinging heavily to his suit jacket. He did not look at me directly when he entered my home. Instead, he looked instantly at the expensive antique clock on the stone mantelpiece and the original oil paintings hanging on the walls. He was quietly appraising the inventory of my estate, not assessing the actual patient. "Dad, this is Mr. Davis," Simone said gently, guiding the corrupt man to the floral sofa opposite my chair. "He is a senior caseworker from the State Department of Elder Services, and he is just here to have a quick chat with you today to see exactly how you are doing." I slowly lowered my morning newspaper and looked at them blankly over the rim of my reading glasses. I let my mouth hang open just slightly, a specific physical trick I learned from observing guilty suspects who desperately wanted to appear completely harmless. "Who is he?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly thin and raspy. "Is he the new man here to fix the broken gutters?" Simone let out a loud, choked sob and turned quickly to Davis. "You see, Mr. Davis," she cried. "He actually thinks you are the neighborhood handyman. He does not even know what day of the week it is anymore. Just yesterday, he tried to make toast and almost burned the entire kitchen down to the ground. I had to physically disconnect the stove just to keep us safe. I gripped the fabric armrest of my chair, squeezing it tightly. That was a complete vicious lie. I had not even touched the kitchen stove in over a week because Simone had been ordering heavy, greasy takeout food, actively trying to keep us sluggish and sedated. But I absolutely could not defend myself right now. Defending myself would make me look highly aggressive, and aggression was a key documented symptom of advanced dementia. Total silence was my only available shield in this room. Davis opened his battered briefcase and pulled out a cheap metal clipboard. He clicked his plastic pen loudly. "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to ask you a few very simple questions today," Davis said, his tone incredibly bored and entirely scripted. "There is absolutely no need to be nervous." "I'm not nervous at all," I muttered, looking down at the woven rug on the floor. "I just want my hot tea." "Question 1, Davis said, completely ignoring my response. "Can you tell me exactly what year it is today?" I paused for a very long time. I knew exactly what year it was. I knew the exact date, the precise time, and the current opening price of the stock market. But Jeremiah Mercer, the helpless victim, absolutely did not know. I squinted hard at the front window. "It is 19, I stammered. "No, it is 2002. Davis made a quick, heavy check mark on his paper. He did not even bother to look up at my face. 2002, okay, Davis repeated mechanically. "Can you tell me the name of the current president of the country?" I stayed completely silent again, watching a small fly buzz against the glass window pane. I watched Simone anxiously twisting her expensive wedding ring round and round her finger. She was incredibly nervous today. She desperately needed this corrupt man to sign that official paper. "I do not follow any politics," I said, finally letting my voice trail off. "It just makes people argue too much." Simone leaned forward on the sofa, playing her part to the absolute maximum. "Dad, you definitely know this answer. We literally talked about it this morning," she pleaded. "See, Mr. Davis, his short-term memory is completely gone. He tells me the exact same stories about his childhood over and over again, but he cannot remember what he ate for breakfast an hour ago." Davis nodded his head, scribbling furiously on his clipboard. He was not actually writing detailed notes. I could easily see the lazy angle of his pen. He was just mindlessly filling in tiny bubbles on a predetermined state form. He had walked into my home with his mind already completely made up, fully paid for by my son-in-law. "Let us try a physical cognitive test now," Davis said, pulling out a blank sheet of white paper and a thick black marker. "I want you to draw a simple clock face for me, Mr. Mercer. Just put all the numbers inside the circle and set the hands to exactly 10:11. This was the standard mini mental state examination specifically designed by doctors to test visual and spatial brain function. I slowly took the thick marker from his hand. My hand began to shake violently. This time I did not even have to fake the intense tremor. The pure boiling rage inside my chest was making my entire body vibrate. I was a man who had built a massive federal career on absolute precision on deeply analyzing the complex fractals of international financial fraud, and right now I was being forced to draw a circle like a helpless toddler. I drew the large circle on the paper. I made it highly lopsided and intentionally jagged. I wrote the numbers down, but I crowded all of them entirely onto the right side of the clock face, leaving the left side completely empty. It is a classic, undeniable medical sign of severe parietal lobe damage. I had studied these specific tests extensively at the Bureau. I knew exactly how to fail them perfectly. When I finally finished the drawing, I dropped the black marker onto the table and looked directly at Simone. She was actually smiling. It was a very small, highly triumphant smile that she quickly tried to hide behind her manicured hand, but I saw it clearly. She was not looking at her loving father with any real pity. She was looking at a major financial obstacle that was finally being permanently removed from her path. "Oh, Dad," Simone sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Look at that drawing. It is okay. We know you are really trying your best today." Davis took the paper back and made a huge, exaggerated show of examining the broken circle. "Well, this is highly concerning," Davis said, shaking his head. "This absolutely indicates the significant cognitive impairment, especially coupled with the previous reports of aggression and the severe fire risk in the kitchen." He trailed off, leaving the heavy unspoken threat completely hanging in the quiet air of my living room. "Reports of aggression?" I asked, letting my voice rise in a perfect, shaky panic. I never hurt anyone in my entire life." Simone jumped in immediately, cutting me off with absolute ruthless efficiency. "Dad, stop, do not get completely agitated again," she scolded, her voice dripping with fake patience. "Remember exactly what happened with Mom yesterday. You were screaming at her so loudly. You scared her so much she had to physically lock herself inside the upstairs bathroom." I looked at my own daughter sitting comfortably on my floral sofa. The terrible lie was so incredibly smooth, so perfectly practiced. She was actively gaslighting me in real time, completely rewriting our family history just to fit her vicious, greedy narrative. I desperately wanted to stand up right then and there. I wanted to violently shout that I had the secret audio recordings. I wanted to loudly play the video of her screaming at her frail mother, but I absolutely could not. Not yet. The steel jaws of the trap were not fully sprung. Davis closed his cheap metal clipboard with a loud, definitive snap. "Mr. Mercer, based strictly on my professional observation today and the sworn testimony of your primary caregiver, I am highly recommending an immediate full review of your legal guardianship status," Davis announced coldly. "You are displaying incredibly clear signs of early onset dementia with highly dangerous behavioral disturbances." He turned his small, shifting eyes toward Simone, and his voice dropped down into a low, conspiratorial whisper. "You absolutely need to file for emergency temporary custody right away," Davis advised her. "He is a massive, unpredictable danger to himself and to your poor mother. If he continues to control the family finances or the critical medical decisions, well, it could be utterly catastrophic for everyone involved." Simone wiped another completely fake tear from her cheek, nodding her head in solemn, tragic agreement. "Thank you so much, Mr. Davis," she whispered, playing the devastated child. "I just desperately want them to be safe. It completely breaks my heart to do this to him, but if it is the only way, then it is the only way." Davis stood up from the sofa, smoothing down his wrinkled polyester suit jacket. "I will personally expedite the state paperwork this afternoon," he promised, picking up his battered briefcase. "You should have the emergency court order signed by a judge by tomorrow afternoon at the absolute latest." As Davis moved toward the front hallway, the heavy oak door swung open and Terrence walked right inside. He was wearing another expensive suit, sweating profusely in the morning heat, carrying a thick manila envelope in his right hand. He looked past me, completely ignoring my existence in the living room chair, and walked straight up to the corrupt social worker in the foyer. "Is it completely done?" Terrence asked, his voice low and incredibly urgent. "Did he fail the assessment test?" "He failed it spectacularly, Terrence." Simone answered proudly, stepping into the hallway to join her husband. "Mr. Davis is going to fast-track the legal conservatorship with the local judge today. We will have total absolute control of the entire estate by tomorrow morning." I sat perfectly still in my armchair, staring blankly at the dark television screen across the room. I slowly reached my left hand deep into the pocket of my frayed cardigan. My fingers found the small textured button of the micro audio recorder, the exact one I had activated before they even walked through the door. I pressed it firmly against the fabric, ensuring it was capturing every single damning syllable echoing from the hard wooden floors of the foyer. "I need the paperwork filed before the banks open tomorrow," Terrence demanded, stepping closer to Davis. "If we do not have the legal authority to liquidate the trust fund by Friday, we are all going to lose absolutely everything. I can get it pushed to the very top of the judge pile," Davis replied, his voice suddenly losing its fake professional tone, becoming completely greedy and transactional. "But we explicitly discussed a specific expedition fee for this kind of rapid, highly irregular state action. The courts do not just hand over a $2 million estate without a lot of heavy bureaucratic friction." Terrence let out a frustrated, angry sigh, but he did not argue the point. He knew exactly how the dark, corrupt machinery of the city actually worked. He held up the thick manila envelope, the heavy paper bulging with thick stacks of federal currency. "Here is $5,000 in completely untraceable cash," Terrence said, shoving the envelope aggressively into the social worker's eager hands. "This is the rest of your bribe, exactly as we discussed. Do not fail me, Davis, or I swear I will ruin your entire career." Davis quickly stuffed the thick envelope into his battered briefcase, looking around the hallway nervously. "It will be completely done, Terrence," Davis promised, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the stolen cash. "Just have your lawyer draft the final asset transfer documents tonight. Once the judge signs my emergency medical declaration tomorrow, Jeremiah Mercer will not even have the legal right to buy a cup of coffee, let alone control a massive financial trust." I listened to the heavy front door finally close, sealing the wicked deal they had just struck in my own home. I felt completely, utterly stripped naked. My sharp intelligence, my personal dignity, and my fundamental agency as a living human being had just been casually dismantled and sold for $5,000 in a manila envelope. Simone walked back into the living room, her entire demeanor changing in an absolute instant. The sad grieving daughter act was completely gone. She looked down at me with pure freezing indifference. "Well, that went incredibly well today," she said casually, picking up the lopsided clock drawing I had made. "You should go take a long nap, Dad. Terrence and I are going to start packing up your clothes. We are moving you into the small guest room downstairs tonight. It is just much safer for you without the stairs." She turned around and walked straight into the kitchen, actually humming a happy, upbeat tune under her breath. She was genuinely happy today. She thought she had definitively won the massive high-stakes war. I sat alone in my chair, the micro recorder burning a hot, undeniable hole in my pocket. I was not just a tired old man to them anymore. I was a solved problem, a rapidly depreciating liability that had finally been liquidated. But they had made one massive, critical error. They completely assumed that the frail, broken man sitting in this chair was the exact same man on their forged papers. I pressed the stop button on my hidden recorder, saving the pristine, high-definition audio file of their cash bribe. "You want to legally declare me incompetent, Simone?" I thought to myself, listening to her humming in my kitchen. "Go right ahead, file your corrupt papers and bring your crooked judge, because tomorrow you are going to face the absolute wrath of a ghost." I waited in the stifling heat of my own living room until I finally heard the heavy front door latch click shut. Simone and Terrence had left the house completely confident in their wicked temporary victory. I immediately dropped the frail, confused old man act, standing up straight and stretching the painful tension out of my spine. I grabbed my car keys from the wooden bowl in the foyer and walked out into the blinding Atlanta sun. I was absolutely not going to a doctor today, and I was definitely not going to look at a nursing home brochure. I drove my beige sedan straight into the towering glass heart of the financial district to see my lawyer. Calvin was not a polite family attorney who handled simple wills or quiet, friendly divorces. Calvin was a ruthless, brilliant legal predator. He was the exact kind of terrifying man you hired when you needed to absolutely destroy a rival corporation or completely bury a toxic, dangerous enemy. His private office was located on the top floor of a sleek glass tower, offering a commanding panoramic view of the entire city. It was a sprawling suite of dark mahogany wood, expensive leather chairs, and sharp modern art. The room was designed specifically to intimidate anyone who dared to walk through his heavy oak doors. Calvin was sitting behind his massive desk, wearing a dark, tailored suit that easily cost more than most vehicles. He looked up sharply as I entered the room, his dark eyes instantly reading the cold, unyielding tension locked in my jaw. He knew me extremely well from my active days at the Federal Bureau, and he knew perfectly well that Jeremiah Mercer did not make casual social calls. "Jeremiah, please sit down," Calvin said, gesturing smoothly to a plush leather chair opposite his desk. "What exactly brings the legendary ghost of the Federal Task Force into my office today?" I did not sit down. I reached into my jacket pocket and I tossed the encrypted black flash drive directly onto his polished desk. "I need a trap, Calvin," I said, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion. "I need a very specific, completely inescapable legal snare, crafted right now. My own daughter and her husband are trying to steal my entire estate to pay off a $500,000 mob debt, and they are actively drugging my sick wife to do it." Calvin stopped moving entirely. The professional corporate mask vanished from his face in a single second, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a legal assassin. He picked up the small flash drive, plugging it directly into his highly secure computer terminal. He clicked silently through the digital files I had compiled. He listened to the clear audio of the cash bribe, he examined the forged bank checks, and he carefully reviewed the massive offshore gambling transfers. "This is not just simple domestic fraud," Jeremiah Calvin murmured, his eyes scanning the glowing screen with absolute intense focus. "This is federal money laundering, criminal conspiracy, and severe documented elder abuse. We can easily get an emergency injunction from a judge right now and immediately freeze every single account they have ever touched." "No, Calvin," I said, leaning my heavy hands flat on his mahogany desk. "A simple injunction just delays them, and it gives them valuable time to run away. I absolutely do not want to delay them today. I want to utterly destroy them. I want to gladly hand them the exact loaded weapon they are begging for, and I want to watch them pull the trigger themselves." Calvin leaned back slowly in his expensive chair, a dark, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "What exactly do you have in mind, my old friend?" he asked, steepling his fingers together. I need you to meticulously draft a total, unconditional asset transfer contract, I instructed, pacing the length of his large office. I want it to look exactly like the complete surrender they are aggressively demanding. I want it to officially hand over the house, the investment portfolios, and the absolute power of attorney, but Calvin, I need it to be completely legally fake. Calvin nodded slowly, perfectly, understanding the assignment, his fingers flying rapidly across his silent keyboard. I can easily use a highly specific legal watermark on the paper, he explained, staring at his monitor. To the untrained, greedy eye of your son-in-law, it looks exactly like official binding bond paper. But in any actual court of law, that specific watermark immediately designates the entire document as a non-binding draft. It holds absolutely no legal weight whatsoever. It is just a piece of trash. That is a very good start, I said, feeling the steel jaws of the trap finally snapping together in my mind. But I need one more crucial, deadly element added to that document. I need a full, undeniable criminal confession permanently buried deep in the fine print. Calvin raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed by the sheer ruthlessness of the request. A confession, he asked, looking back up at me. Yes, I confirmed, my voice as hard as solid rock. Down in the final clauses of the contract, right where arrogant men like Terrence never bother to actually read the text. I want a clause that explicitly states that by accepting this document, he absolutely admits to total liability for all outstanding federal debts. I want him to legally confess to the falsification of medical records and the intentional laundering of monetary instruments under federal law. Calvin began typing furiously again, actively weaving my deadly requests into a dense, impenetrable thicket of complex legal jargon. Clause 17, Section B. Calvin said aloud, reading the text as he carefully constructed the perfect snare. It will completely look like standard liability waiver language, entirely boring and incredibly dense. But legally, it is a signed, notarized confession to massive federal crimes, including racketeering violations. If Terrence actually accepts this document with your signature on it, he is literally holding his own long prison sentence in his greedy hands. Print it right now, I commanded, feeling the hot adrenaline surging through my tired veins. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the room hummed to life, sliding out thick, crisp pages of the deadly contract. Calvin carefully gathered the warm papers, tapping them perfectly square and placing them into a sleek, unmarked black folder. He handed the heavy folder across the polished desk. Be incredibly careful with this, Jeremiah. Calvin warned, his voice dropping into a solemn, highly serious tone. When you walk into that room to sign this tomorrow, you are walking into a desperate corner with dangerous people. If they realize for 1 second you are actively playing them, they have absolutely nothing left to lose. I took the black folder, feeling its solid, comforting weight in my hands. I am not playing a game, Calvin, I said, turning to leave his sprawling, beautiful office. I am just delivering the absolute final verdict. The drive back from Calvin and his high-rise office felt like a quiet victory lap. The blinding Atlanta sun was beating down on the interstate, but for the very first time in days, I felt a solid lightness in my chest. Calvin had prepared the legal landmines perfectly. We had drafted a contract that would completely trap Terrence and Simone in a massive web of federal litigation the exact moment they tried to touch a single cent. I had the secret audio recordings safely stored. I had the bank statements proving the offshore money laundering. I was absolutely ready to spring the trap. I even stopped at a small bakery on Peachtree Street just to buy Ruby a fresh slice of sweet peach cobbler, her absolute favorite treat. I imagined us sitting together in the quiet sunroom, sharing it in secret, quietly celebrating a small victory before the final brutal battle tomorrow morning. But when I turned my beige sedan onto our quiet, tree-lined street, the warm feeling of triumph evaporated instantly. It was violently replaced by a cold, primal dread that settled heavily in the base of my spine. The wide concrete driveway was completely empty of their luxury cars, but there were deep, heavy tire tracks pressed into the manicured grass near the curb. They were thick, dual-tread tires, the exact kind of heavy tires that belong to a commercial truck or a city ambulance. I parked my car crookedly on the concrete, leaving the engine running, and sprinted toward the front door. The heavy oak door was unlocked, hanging slightly open in the humid breeze. I pushed it wide open, and the unnatural silence of the house hit me like a massive physical blow. It was not the peaceful, comfortable silence of an empty afternoon. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a freshly dug grave. "Ruby." I called out loudly, my voice cracking with a sudden intense panic. "Ruby, are you here?" I ran straight down the hardwood hallway, dropping the bakery box and the black legal folder onto the floor. I sprinted directly to the bright sunroom. Her floral armchair was completely empty. Her knitting basket was violently overturned on the woven rug balls of yellow yarn unraveling across the floor, looking like spilled intestines. The half-finished puzzle on the small wooden table had been violently knocked askew, exactly as if someone had been dragged away from it against their will. I ran to the kitchen, finding it completely empty. I ran up the main staircase, taking the wooden steps 2 at a time, my bad knee protesting fiercely with every single impact. But I absolutely did not care about the pain. The master bedroom was completely empty. The upstairs bathroom was completely empty. She was gone. I stood frozen in the upstairs hallway, breathing incredibly hard, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I felt a sudden wave of dizzying panic. I grabbed the wooden door frame just to steady myself. "Think, Jeremiah," I told myself, forcing the federal agent back into control. "Think like a hunter." I walked slowly back downstairs to the kitchen. That was exactly when I saw it. A single sheet of yellow legal paper sitting perfectly in the center of the large granite island. It was held down by a heavy glass salt shaker. I walked toward it, my legs feeling like solid blocks of lead. I recognized the messy handwriting immediately. It was Terrence, and his jagged scrawl rushed and arrogant. The short note read, "Mom had a very violent episode today. For her own safety and ours, we absolutely had to call emergency medical services. She is being held at the Crestview Psychiatric Facility for a mandatory 72-hour observation period under strict state statute. If you ever want to see her again, bring the property deed and the signed power of attorney to my downtown office tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Do not bring any lawyers and do not call the police. We just want to help her get better." I crumpled the yellow paper into a tight ball in my fist. "Help her," I whispered to the empty room. They absolutely did not want to help her. They had just kidnapped my wife. They had maliciously used the corrupt state legal system as a weapon against my family. They had likely told the hired paramedics she was a severe danger to herself. They had deliberately used the fabricated medical history and the poisoned symptoms from yesterday to quickly convince a corrupt doctor to sign an involuntary psychiatric hold order. It was a vicious kidnapping completely sanctioned by a bribed state official. I pulled out my phone and rapidly checked the notification history from my home security system. I'd been so intensely focused on my meeting with Calvin that I'd carelessly silenced my alerts. There it was, sitting on the screen. Motion detected in the living room at exactly 10:15 this morning. I quickly opened the security application and watched the recorded footage. It was the absolute most painful thing I've ever watched in my entire life. I saw a private unmarked ambulance pull up to the house. 2 large men in paramedic uniforms stepped out closely, followed by Terrence. Terrence was perfectly acting the part of the highly distraught son, wringing his hands and pointing frantically at the front door. They quickly entered the house. I switched the video feed to the interior sunroom camera. I saw my beautiful Ruby sitting quietly in her chair, working peacefully on her puzzle. She looked up and smiled genuinely, expecting me to walk into the room. Instead, she saw 3 large strangers. Terrence pointed directly at her. "She has a deadly weapon," Terrence shouted loudly on the audio feed. "She violently threatened to kill us all today." Ruby absolutely did not have a weapon. She only had a small plastic knitting needle. She held it up, looking completely confused and terrified. "No," she said, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm just making a yellow scarf." The fake paramedics absolutely did not wait to listen to her. They moved in aggressively. One of the large men violently grabbed her thin arm. She screamed loudly, fighting back with everything she had. "Jeremiah," she cried out, looking around for me. "Help me, Jeremiah." I watched my beautiful wife of 40 years being forcefully strapped down to a heavy medical gurney while she desperately cried out my name. I watched Terrence standing safely in the corner of the room, actually smirking as he eagerly signed the official transport paperwork. I watched them brutally wheel her right out of our home, leaving behind the overturned basket and the suffocating silence. I dropped my phone. It clattered loudly onto the hard kitchen tile. A sound completely escaped my throat. It started as a low, painful groan and rapidly rose into a massive roar of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a terrifying sound I did not even know I was capable of making. It was the sound of a man who had played strictly by the federal rules his entire life, finally realizing that the rules simply no longer applied. I had carelessly left her alone today. I had been so incredibly busy being smart and so busy being a clever detective that I had completely failed to be a protective husband. I had left her utterly defenseless against ravenous wolves. I stumbled blindly into the downstairs bathroom. I desperately needed freezing cold water. I needed to shock myself completely back into cold reality. I turned on the silver faucet and splashed the icy water onto my face. It dripped slowly down my nose, mixing heavily with the hot tears of intense frustration that I absolutely refused to let fall. I looked up slowly, staring into the large mirror above the sink. The man staring back at me looked incredibly old. He looked weak, and he looked exactly like the pathetic victim Terrence and Simone truly thought he was. He looked exactly like a broken man who would blindly sign away a massive deed just to save his captive wife. He looked exactly like a man who had finally lost the war. I absolutely hated that man in the mirror. I pulled my heavy right fist back and punched the glass with all my strength. The sound of the bathroom mirror completely shattering was incredibly loud and incredibly sharp, exactly like a gunshot echoing in the quiet house. Shards of reflective glass rained heavily down into the white porcelain sink. The old broken reflection was completely fractured, splintered into 1,000 jagged, bleeding pieces. Severe pain shot violently up my right arm as I slowly pulled my heavy hand back from the sink. My knuckles were completely split open and bleeding heavily. Dark, thick red blood dripped slowly onto the pristine white porcelain. I stared blankly at the bright blood. It was completely real, and the intense, sharp pain was incredibly clarifying. It violently burned away the rising panic inside my chest. It violently burned away the heavy, suffocating guilt of leaving her alone, and most importantly, it violently burned away my hesitation. I was absolutely not Jeremiah Mercer, the tired retiree, anymore. I was absolutely not the frail grandfather sitting safely in a worn living room chair. I looked deeply into the fractured reflection of the remaining glass. The tired old man was completely gone. In his specific place was something else entirely. It was something much colder and something infinitely harder. Terrence and Simone desperately wanted a brutal war. They desperately wanted to use physical force to take the only person I truly loved in this world and maliciously use her as cheap leverage in a terrible negotiation for a house. They had just made a massive, absolutely fatal error in judgment. You absolutely do not ever negotiate with violent terrorists. You completely and utterly eliminate them. I quickly wrapped a thick white towel around my bleeding right hand, pulling it incredibly tight until the heavy pressure turned the sharp pain into a dull, steady throb. I walked rapidly out of the downstairs bathroom and went straight into my dark, quiet study. I sat down heavily in my large leather desk chair. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I absolutely did not need them. The dark room was illuminated perfectly only by the cold, harsh blue glow of my 3 massive computer monitors. The shattered glass in the bathroom was a violent testament to the pure rage I had bottled up all week. Now that massive rage had completely distilled into something far more dangerous. It had officially become absolute pinpoint focus. I cracked my uninjured knuckles and leaned my heavy frame directly into the glowing keyboard. The ticking clock on the wall slowly passed 3 in the afternoon. I had exactly 18 hours until the final meeting at Terrence's downtown office. 18 hours until I walked completely alone into the waiting lion den. But before I could confidently walk into that specific room, I absolutely needed to know exactly what was happening inside the locked cage where they were currently keeping my wife. Crestview Psychiatric Facility was a highly expensive private medical institution. In my extensive federal experience, highly expensive private facilities always cut massive security corners. They happily spent millions of dollars on imported mahogany desks for the hospital administrators, and they happily bought Italian marble floors for their waiting lobby. But they always skimped heavily on their digital cybersecurity. They arrogantly assumed that federal patient privacy laws acted as a magical, impenetrable shield that no one would ever dare to cross. They were completely and utterly wrong. I quickly pulled up my hidden encrypted command terminal on the center monitor. I was absolutely not using the loud, clumsy, brute force methods of modern amateur hackers. I was methodically using the old silent federal tools. I was actively using the deep hidden backdoors we used to exploit heavily in the 90s, back when digital infrastructure was completely built by the absolute lowest bidder. I ran a silent, highly aggressive port scan on their external hospital server. Just exactly as I had strongly suspected, port 8080 was completely wide open, left totally exposed for lazy remote maintenance. It took me exactly 12 minutes to completely bypass their incredibly pathetic firewall. It was laughably, insultingly weak. The master password for the main system administrator account was simply the official name of the medical facility followed directly by the current calendar year. It was a massive insult to the very concept of digital security. I was completely in. I navigated silently through the dark, digital architecture of the private hospital. I bypassed the billing departments and went straight for the active patient database. I rapidly typed in the name Mercer Ruby, my fingers flying across the keys. Her new digital medical file popped up instantly on the bright screen. I read the intake status with a freezing heart. It read, "Involuntary hold reason given acute psychotic episode with highly violent homicidal tendencies." I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw physically ached. Lies. They were complete fabricated digital lies stored permanently on a cheap server, completely paid for by my son-in-law and his stolen, laundered money. I found her specific room assignment listed at the bottom of the intake form. Room 304, located deep inside the highly secure locked psychiatric wing. I quickly switched my terminal over to access the physical security subnet of the building. This was the specific isolated network that actively controlled the hallway cameras and the heavy electronic doors. I found the live video feed for the 3rd floor hallway. The image was stark and incredibly white. A bored nurse sat lazily at a central station, scrolling mindlessly through her mobile phone, completely ignoring the red call light blinking urgently above door 302. I clicked directly on the live camera feed for room 304. The digital image flickered with heavy static for a second and then stabilized completely in high-definition, black and white video. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I felt a massive physical pain radiate deep in my chest, exactly as if someone had reached completely inside my rib cage and violently squeezed my heart. Ruby was there. She was lying flat on a narrow, incredibly uncomfortable-looking metal bed. But she was absolutely not sleeping peacefully. She was completely and tightly restrained. Thick, heavy leather straps bound her frail wrists and her ankles directly to the cold metal frame of the hospital bed. She was spread-eagled on the mattress, exactly like a dangerous, violent criminal. Her head was thrashing side to side in obvious distress. I zoomed the digital camera lens in as far as it would possibly go. Her mouth was moving rapidly. There was absolutely no audio feed on this specific security camera, but I'd learned how to read lips perfectly during my deep cover assignments. Jeremiah, she was mouthing silently into the empty room. Jeremiah, please help me. She was desperately calling for me. I watched with burning eyes as a large night orderly walked casually into her locked room. He did not gently check her medical vitals. He did not offer her a simple cup of water. He leaned heavily over the metal bed and said something directly into her face that made her physically flinch in absolute terror. He laughed. It was a casual, incredibly cruel laugh, easily visible even in black and white. Then he aggressively checked the heavy tightness of her leather straps, deliberately pulling them much tighter until I clearly saw Ruby wince in severe, agonizing physical pain. I froze the digital image immediately. I saved the incredibly damning video clip directly to my hard drive. Then I systematically saved the entire 2-hour video buffer from that specific camera. This was absolutely not just standard medical malpractice. This was pure, unadulterated physical torture. And it was exactly all the undeniable federal evidence I desperately needed. I completely bypassed the corrupt local police forces who might be easily swayed by Terrence and his expensive connections, or the fake paperwork from that bribed social worker. This specific video was a massive, documented violation of fundamental federal patient rights. And given the entirely fraudulent nature of her medical admission, it was officially federal kidnapping across state lines, especially since the massive facility funding involved federal insurance payouts, which I absolutely knew it did. I closed the main viewing window, but I kept the silent digital connection wide open. I carefully routed the live video feed directly to my secure off-site cloud server. I wanted a permanent, unerasable record of every single agonizing second she spent in that absolute hell. I picked up my encrypted burner phone from the desk drawer. It was officially time to actively summon the absolute worst nightmare Terrence had ever faced. I dialed a specific, highly secure number, a private line I had not actively called in over 5 long years. It belonged to a man named Roland, a senior special agent currently leading the federal racketeering task force down in Miami. Roland and I had spent a decade tearing apart violent cartels together, and he was the exact kind of ruthless, dedicated man who completely hated arrogant bullies even more than I did. The secure line rang exactly twice before it was abruptly answered. Mercer Rowland rasped into the heavy receiver, his voice sounding exactly like rough gravel grinding on hard pavement. "It is almost 4 a.m. here. You absolutely better have a fresh dead body or a massive federal lead." "I actually have both, Roland," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady and as freezing cold as the winter wind. "I'm actively sending you a massive, heavily encrypted digital packet right now. Check your secure federal email server immediately." I heard the rapid, heavy click of a computer mouse on his end of the line. Then there was an incredibly long, heavy silence as Roland quickly read through the massive files I had systematically compiled. He saw the undeniable bank statement showing Terrence and his sloppy money laundering the massive wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, the crystal-clear photos of the forgery, the audio of the cash bribe, and finally the horrific video clip I had just downloaded. "Is this actually your wife, Jeremiah?" Roland finally asked, his voice suddenly completely losing its rough, irritated edge. It was incredibly quiet now, deadly and terrifyingly quiet. "Yes, Roland," I said, staring blankly at my glowing monitor. "They maliciously took her away from my home yesterday afternoon. They are actively holding her hostage right now, physically torturing her with heavy sedatives just to force me to sign over a $2 million trust fund. The final signing meeting is at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, right at my son-in-law and his downtown corporate office. Roland let out a very long, slow breath over the secure line. This is massive wire fraud, massive money laundering, horrific elder abuse, and blatant federal kidnapping. Roland listed off his federal instincts, completely taking over. And since those offshore bank transfers absolutely crossed international lines, we have total absolute federal jurisdiction over every single piece of this operation. I desperately need a tactical team, Roland, I said, gripping the edge of my wooden desk. I absolutely do not want the corrupt local city cops involved in this. Terrence clearly has the local social workers completely in his greedy pocket, and he might have the local judges too. I need a full, undeniable federal extraction team on the ground. You will absolutely have it, my friend, Roland promised, his voice turning into cold, hard steel. I will have a heavily armed tactical unit staged exactly 2 blocks from that corporate office, fully ready by 8:30 in the morning. We will just wait quietly in the shadows for your exact signal. What is the precise trigger for the breach? I'm going to walk right into that boardroom completely alone, I said, watching the live video feed of my frail wife breathing heavily on that terrible metal bed. I'm going to let them arrogantly think they have completely won the war. I'm going to let them gladly put the silver pen right into my hand. But Roland, I absolutely need another heavily armed team over at the Crestview psychiatric facility at the exact same time. I'm already strictly on it, Jeremiah. Roland replied instantly, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the phone line. I am directly dispatching a specialized medical extraction unit to Crestview right now. We will violently secure your wife, and we will absolutely arrest every single corrupt doctor in that entire building. Do not worry about her anymore, Jeremiah. By noon tomorrow, these arrogant people will deeply wish they had never been born. I hung up the burner phone, the loud click echoing in the dark study. I spent the rest of the incredibly long night preparing for the absolute end. I took a hot shower, scrubbing the heavy exhaustion completely from my face. I dressed meticulously in my absolute best suit, a charcoal gray wool that I exclusively used to wear for federal grand jury testimonies. I carefully polished my black leather shoes until they shone perfectly like dark obsidian. I stood silently in front of the tall mirror in the hallway. I carefully adjusted my silk tie. I looked at the specific man in the reflection. He absolutely did not look like a retired, defeated grandfather anymore. He looked exactly like an apex predator who had just been violently woken from a very long hibernation. I carefully checked my hidden equipment, placing the micro audio recorder safely back in my lapel and linking my mobile phone directly to Roland and his secure federal communications frequency. I walked into the dark kitchen and made a single cup of black coffee. I drank it, standing completely up, staring blankly at the empty spot where Ruby and her favorite antique tea set used to sit. They had violently taken my peace. They had violently taken my wife. They had maliciously tried to completely take my dignity. I quickly rinsed the ceramic cup and set it carefully in the metal sink. I walked to the heavy front door and pulled it wide open. The dark city sky was just starting to turn a bruised, deep purple in the east. The new dawn was finally coming. I stepped out into the incredibly cool morning air. I absolutely did not lock the front door behind me today. I would not need any keys where I was going. I climbed into my beige sedan and confidently started the engine. It purred to life instantly. "I'm coming for you, Terrence," I whispered quietly to the empty car, "and I am bringing absolute federal hell right with me." I pulled out of the driveway, heading straight toward the towering glass city, fully ready to completely burn their entire world to the ground. The elevator ride to the 30th floor of the Millennium Tower was completely smooth and entirely silent, a massive contrast to the violent storm currently brewing inside my chest. The heavy metal doors slid open, revealing a sprawling corporate lobby that smelled intensely of expensive leather and pure intimidation. This was supposedly Terrence and his grand domain, or rather it was the exact expensive domain he desperately rented just to convince the naive world he was a highly successful master of the universe. I stepped out slowly onto the plush carpet, intentionally allowing my broad shoulders to slump heavily forward and letting my steady gait turn into a pathetic, agonizing shuffle. I leaned my weight completely onto a cheap wooden cane that I had bought at a corner pharmacy just an hour ago. To the polished receptionist sitting at the front desk, I was just another highly confused geriatric client completely lost in the cold maze of corporate law. To the security camera blinking quietly in the corner, I was an absolute non-threat. I made my slow, painful way down the long hallway, heading directly toward the heavy double-glass doors at the very end. Through the frosted glass panes, I could easily see the dark silhouettes of the exact people anxiously waiting for me to arrive. They looked exactly like hungry vultures perched high on a telephone wire, just waiting for the fresh carcass to finally cool. I took a very deep breath, fully inhaling the sterile, freezing air conditioning, and slowly exhaled the absolute last ounce of my human mercy. I pushed the heavy glass doors wide open and stepped right into the lion den. The corporate conference room was incredibly vast, specifically designed to make absolutely anyone sitting on the opposite side of the table feel incredibly small and insignificant. Terrence sat arrogantly at the very head of the massive mahogany table, relaxing in a high-backed leather chair that looked exactly like a king sitting on his royal throne. He was wearing another incredibly expensive suit, a suit that easily cost more than my first car, but he wore it terribly today. He was sweating profusely. A thin, nervous sheen of hot perspiration glistened clearly on his upper lip, and his right leg was bouncing violently under the table. He was a truly desperate man, rapidly running out of stolen time. Simone sat comfortably to his immediate right. She did not even bother to look up at me when I slowly entered the room. She was completely focused on her glowing phone screen, her manicured thumb scrolling mindlessly a specific physical tic she had developed as a young teenager exactly whenever she was telling a massive lie. She looked perfectly polished, completely detached from the horrific reality that her own mother was currently strapped to a cold metal bed, all because of her endless, suffocating greed. Next to my daughter sat a slick, overly confident man, spreading thick file folders out across the table like a royal flush. He was Terrence, and his corrupt corporate lawyer, a man named Sterling, a man I instantly recognized from my old federal court days. Sterling had been officially disbarred twice before and only reinstated on highly dubious technicalities. He was the exact kind of slimy, unethical attorney you hired when you desperately needed to bury a dead body, not legally write a simple family will. But it was the incredibly large, quiet man sitting on the far left side of the table who completely drew my immediate tactical attention. He was absolutely not a lawyer, and he was absolutely not a corporate investor. He was wearing a dark suit that was much too tight across his massive shoulders, and his heavy knuckles were completely covered in thick white scar tissue. He sat with a terrifying absolute stillness, a stillness that screamed of professional, calculated violence. Terrence quickly introduced him as Mr. Vance, claiming he was a highly interested potential investor in his new tech startup. I knew infinitely better. I instantly recognized the faded dark ink peeking out from under his white shirt cuff. It was a massive spiderweb tattoo right on his thick wrist. This man was the ruthless collection agent for the gambling syndicate, sitting right here in the room to make absolutely sure the massive debt was paid today before he violently broke Terrence in his legs. "You are incredibly late today, Jeremiah," Terrence snapped rudely, not even bothering to stand up and greet his own father-in-law. "We have a very tight schedule to keep this morning, and we do not have time for games." "I'm so incredibly sorry, Terrence," I mumbled weakly, letting my voice waver and crack perfectly. The morning city traffic was terrible and my bad hip is really bothering me today. I slowly shuffled my way over to the single empty chair positioned at the far end of the incredibly long table. It was deliberately set much lower than all the other chairs in the room, placed intentionally by Terrence, so I would have to literally look up at them like a begging child. I sat down with a heavy, agonizing groan, making a huge, pathetic show of carefully arranging my cheap wooden cane and slowly pulling my reading glasses from my pocket. I clearly saw Mr. Vance check his heavy steel watch, letting out a low, irritated sigh. He shot Terrence a dark, threatening look, a look that could have easily cut through solid glass. "Let us completely skip the fake pleasantries today," Sterling said, sliding a massive, thick legal document directly across the polished mahogany wood. "We have fully prepared the absolute transfer of all family assets exactly as we previously discussed. This binding document legally grants Terrence and Simone full and durable power of attorney and immediate total financial control of the entire Mercer Family Trust, which officially includes the complete real estate portfolio." I looked down slowly at the massive stack of papers. It was incredibly thick, incredibly heavy, and incredibly final. It was the official instrument of my total destruction printed on crisp white paper, but safely tucked inside my own inner jacket pocket, completely hidden from their greedy eyes, was the actual contract Calvin had drafted, the one perfectly laced with federal poison. Terrence leaned aggressively forward over the table, his dark eyes absolutely manic with unadulterated greed. "It is completely standard procedure, Jeremiah," he insisted smoothly, his voice vibrating with desperate anticipation. "We just desperately need to quickly liquidate the trust assets simply to pay for Ruby and her expensive medical care. That new psychiatric facility is absolutely not cheap, you know. We are only doing all of this for her own safety and for your total peace of mind." I looked directly at my daughter Simone. She finally raised her eyes from her phone to briefly meet my gaze. There was absolutely no daughterly love there today, only a hard, freezing glint of pure greed, heavily mixed with a deep, hidden fear. She was absolutely terrified of the violent man with the spiderweb tattoo, but she was completely willing to sacrifice her own father simply to appease the hungry wolves. She had absolutely no idea that the quiet old man staring back at her was about to completely pull the floor right out from under her feet. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a quiet whisper, letting the heavy silence of the massive corporate boardroom stretch out around us. "I just desperately want to know exactly how my wife is doing today before we do any of this." Terrence let out a loud, highly irritated sigh, completely annoyed by my genuine human concern. "She's completely sedated right now, Jeremiah," he said quickly, waving his manicured hand in the air, exactly as if he were casually dismissing a minor, insignificant detail.